want to live in the kind of state that, from one side of its mouth, beseeches Muslim communities to cooperate and to root out the ideology of extremism from within our communities, and reaches out to Muslim communities a hand of friendship and says, you are our allies in this fight against jihadist terror, and yet from the other side of its mouth is threatening the heavy hand, in effect taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut, by saying we will bear down heavily on all of you if you don't report your brother or your son or your daughter to the authorities the minute you have any suspicion that they're engaged in something dodgy. Just imagine what kind of position that puts these families in vis-à-vis the state. Immediately, the state stops becoming your partner against extremist ideology and instead is your watchdog, standing there ready to arrest you, ready to detain you if it doesn't think you've done your job properly. That isn't a partnership. That is a relationship of inequality, of unequals. And so I would suggest that in its effort to fight terrorism, if it were to implement this kind of policy, the state would be cutting its nose to spite its face, because it would be to the detriment of the counter-extremism effort that is the real solution in the long term to challenging terrorism. You could end up having some really solid counter-terrorism successes at the expense of the long-term counter-extremism effort that's needed by the communities, because you end up being unable to work with those very same communities because they're constantly worried that they're going to be arrested by you as the state for not reporting enough suspicious activity against their own friends and family members. An incredibly awkward thing to have to do. Keep in mind there have been errors in such processes, whether it's the shooting in error of Jean-Charles de Menezes, or indeed the shooting in error in Forest Gate in East London during a raid of somebody that was arrested for suspicion of terrorism, shot by police, released without charge, found to be completely innocent and exonerated, and is now a taxi driver in London, called into my show on one occasion, and I was incredibly grateful because he said he forgives the police, loves Britain and bears no ill will towards our society, though the police shot him, accidentally or deliberately, one only knows, one doesn't know, but in a raid. And so you've got these kinds of relationships that are crucial for the state to cultivate, to root out the ideology of extremism in our country, and you can't, at the expense of counter-extremism, pursue a strictly counter-terrorism policy, because the real long-term solution is counter-extremism. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention as to why I disagree with Max Hill's suggestion, and that is that I think it speaks to the kind of state and society we want to live in. But another reason is, consider this. The government's prevent counter-extremism policy, though I've defended its need to remain in existence on multiple occasions on my show, I concede isn't very popular within Muslim communities. And the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, recently called for it to be scrapped, and I said he doesn't know what he's talking about. And actually, I would challenge anyone to speak about counter-extremism. If they call for the scrapping of the government's prevent policy, which is its counter-extremism policy, I'll tell you now, they don't know what they're speaking about. They don't know the counter-extremism brief, because the only alternative to challenging extremism in our societies is a clampdown on our civil liberties and a stronger, heavier state hand. So if you don't want that, then the only option left is the prevent policy. Having said all of that, I concede that the prevent policy is incredibly unpopular within Muslim communities, largely not due to any fault of its own, though it has a PR problem and it has some silly civil servants who don't know what they're talking about involved in it. However, one of the main reasons it isn't popular is because there is a huge amount of propaganda against it within Muslim communities by the prevent lobby. In other words, groups like Cage, groups like Mend, who are Islamist influenced or pro-Islamist in their outlook, have been lobbying against prevent because, guess why? Surprise, surprise. It's designed to challenge those very groups. So no wonder they're going to be up against it. And they've been quite successful in their anti-prevent propaganda within communities. Well, this kind of policy, if implemented, would be a huge propaganda coup for them. For groups that have ideological affiliations with pro-Islamist organisations, such as Cage and Mend, it would be a huge propaganda coup for these organisations. You'd be handing them a propaganda victory if we implemented this kind of policy that would appear, in terms of perceptions, as if the state is collectively punishing families for not sufficiently reporting or, in other words, dobbing in or ratting on their loved ones. I mean, how on earth are you going to convince a father that he should have reported his daughter or son to the authorities on a suspicion? That father's rather going to try, instead, to talk to their loved one, instead of thinking, I know the solution here. If I suspect my child is being a bit naughty, I'll just go and report them to MI5. Really? Is that going to work?
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.